Thanksgiving has always been a time for togetherness, warmth, and sharing. The Williams family cherished this holiday, believing in spreading kindness to those in need. But one cold Thanksgiving evening, their generosity led them to a dinner guest who wasn't what he seemed. By the end of the night, their act of kindness turned into a memory they'd never forget, and one they'd never escape. It was the perfect Thanksgiving night. The Williams dining table was covered with all the holiday staples: a golden brown turkey, steaming mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce glistening in a crystal bowl, and freshly baked rolls. The family of four, Greg, his wife Linda, and their two children, 16-year-old Emily and 10-year-old Jake, were preparing for dinner when Linda glanced out the frosted kitchen window. She noticed their elderly neighbor, Mr. Howard, standing on his porch in the dim light of a single flickering bulb. He looked small and frail, his face pale and drawn as he gazed toward their house. Linda's heart ached. "Poor Mr. Howard," she murmured. "He's all alone again this year. Maybe we should invite him over." Greg hesitated. "We don't know much about him, Linda. He keeps to himself for a reason." But Linda, always the empathetic one, insisted. "It's Thanksgiving, Greg. No one should be alone tonight." Against his better judgment, Greg agreed, and Jake eagerly volunteered to run across the street and invite Mr. Howard. Minutes later, Jake returned, followed by Mr. Howard, who shuffled in slowly, clutching a bouquet of wilted flowers. His voice was soft and gravelly as he thanked them for their kindness. "It's been a long time since I've had dinner with anyone." The evening began pleasantly enough. The family did their best to include Mr. Howard in the conversation, but his answers were short and strange. When Emily asked, "What's your favorite Thanksgiving memory?" Mr. Howard's face darkened. He muttered, "Thanksgiving is about family, but when you lose them, it's about remembrance." His tone was unsettling and the table grew quiet. Linda tried to lighten the mood, asking if he'd like more turkey. Mr. Howard looked at her with a peculiar smile. "No, thank you. I've already eaten. Plenty." As the night progressed, subtle oddities began to pile up. Greg noticed frost creeping along the corners of the dining room windows, even though the heater was set to high. The candles on the table flickered erratically, casting strange shadows across the walls. Jake, wide-eyed, whispered to Emily, "I swear I saw him staring at me when Mom was talking. But when I looked back, he was looking at his plate." Then, Mr. Howard began sharing stories, dark, chilling tales of his past Thanksgivings. "There was a time," he said, his voice low and hollow, "when my home was filled with laughter. My wife and children used to set the table while I carved the turkey. It was perfect, until the fire. The fire took everything. My wife, my boys." His hand trembled as he reached for his glass of water. "I always wondered, why them? Why not me?" The family sat in stunned silence. Linda whispered, "I'm so sorry for your loss." Mr. Howard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Loss," he repeated, almost to himself. "It's a funny thing. It stays with you, like a shadow, and sometimes it comes back." As the evening drew to a close, Mr. Howard stood abruptly. "Thank you for having me," he said, his voice suddenly more forceful. "It's been enlightening." He placed the bouquet of wilted flowers on the table. "A gift for your kindness," and with that, he left, his faded black coat flaring behind him as he disappeared into the night. The family exchanged uneasy glances. Something about Mr. Howard's presence had left the room cold, both physically and emotionally. "Well," Greg said, trying to shake off the tension, "at least we made his night a little better." But the unease lingered. Later that night, as Linda was tidying up, she noticed the flowers Mr. Howard had left. The petals were dry and brittle, crumbling at her touch. Among them was a small card with faint, barely legible handwriting. with gratitude from all of us. All of us, Linda whispered. She turned the card over, but the back was blank. A chill ran down her spine. Meanwhile, Emily was scrolling through her phone, looking at the family photos they'd taken during dinner. As she swiped through the pictures, her heart began to race. "Mom! Dad!" she shouted. The family crowded around her phone. In every photo there was something wrong. Mr. Howard wasn't in a single picture. Instead, behind them, just barely visible in the shadows, stood a tall, dark figure with hollow eyes and an expressionless face. Panic set in. Greg decided to confront Mr. Howard. He grabbed his coat and headed across the street, only to find the house dark and abandoned. The windows were boarded up, the yard overgrown. A neighbor saw him staring and called out, "Looking for someone?" "Mr. Howard," Greg replied. "He lives here, doesn't he?" The neighbor shook his head. "Mr. Howard, he died years ago. Him and his family, they burned in a fire, right on Thanksgiving night." Greg returned home, pale and shaken, to find the rest of his family gathered in the living room. The bouquet of wilted flowers was now sitting on the coffee table, even though Linda swore she had thrown it out. The house grew unnaturally quiet. And then, from the dining room, they heard it. The faint sound of a chair scraping against the floor.